People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. I'm Niresh Aliyatambi. Our country, as we all know, went bankrupt over 2 years ago, and we're not out of the woods yet. And most people are still confused as to what's going on, what's the role of the IMF, does this happen to other countries in the world, and how we are going to actually get out of it. To discuss this and a lot more, I have with me tonight Dr. Hashim bin Rashid, who is a lecturer at the Sociology Department at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. He is also working with the Alternative Law Collective of Pakistan. And we also have Dr. Charles Abugre, Executive Director of IDEAS, which stands for International Development Economics Associates. He is a former director of the UNDP and a former advisor to the President of Ghana. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's talk about where Sri Lanka is in the world when it comes to bankruptcy, indebtedness, and going to the IMF. It came as quite a shock to Sri Lankans when everything ground to a halt about 2 years ago, where the government did not have enough foreign exchange to pay for a shipment of gas or a shipment of petrol or diesel, and the country literally ground to a halt. So things appear to be somewhat better now. There are no long lines at the petrol stations, and there is gas and electricity, but jobs are hard to come by, and economic growth is extremely slow. Dr. Rashid, tell me, is this unusual, or are there a lot of other countries which also suffer from this sort of malady?
I think it's not unusual. I think that's the thing that's important to say. I think sometimes sitting in our own countries, we obviously face the brunt of this economic assault by our political governments, what appears to be our political governments. But there are many countries in the world that are facing the same sort of crisis at the same time, which includes Bangladesh, it includes my country, Pakistan. It also includes Ghana, Argentina, and many other countries which face similar kinds of debt stress, very much induced by both structures in the global economy and how we're positioned within them, and also the particular paradigm that the IMF parrots. And the problem with the IMF paradigm is it advocates contracting the economy to do better, whereas the agenda you need in order to create jobs is actually to reintroduce the developmental state. So we need a developmental paradigm rather than sort of paradigm that advocates shrinking our economies in order to do better.
I see. So we in Sri Lanka, we had our economy shrink for 2 consecutive years, quite drastically, and now there is some hope that the economy will expand at least a little bit, perhaps 2% this year. But that's not really enough, is it? We are in South Asia, which is the fastest growing region in the world when it comes to GDP, with India and the Maldives growing at over 6%, and other countries in the region, with the exception, I think, of Pakistan, growing at around 5%. So what should we be looking at in terms of GDP growth in order to recover? Is it 5%, 6%? And of course, targets are easier said than done. You can't sort of write it down on paper and say we're going to reach 6%. It actually has to work.
I think at this point, both Pakistan and Sri Lanka need to recover our economy to the point it was before the IMF contraction. So, by my estimate, I mean, our economies have lost anywhere between 15 to 20% of their real value, not just due to devaluation, which itself is a massive shrink on the dollar value of our economy, but also in terms of like manufacturing closing down, service sector jobs actually shrinking amidst a paradigm in which everyone is very uncertain about the economic future. In Pakistan, the domestic sort of interest rate that the State Bank of Pakistan gives is about 21%. In this scenario, the possibility of businesses borrowing to be able to expand business is near impossible. People cannot afford to lease cars. People cannot afford to sort of take loans for buying houses. So the overall contraction is something we need to deal with first. Now, how do you move to a developmental paradigm? What the numbers might look like? I think those are questions we need to start asking again. I think those questions need to involve a more significant transformation in the economy towards thinking about how better to integrate people into business in a way that suddenly the shrinking of finance doesn't mean that business is going to collapse. So there's something more foundational about the way we do business and its sort of interrelationship between the ability to get finance, which I think is at play.
Dr. Charles, Sri Lankans are not very familiar with West Africa. Could you tell us about the experience in Ghana?
Before I do that, let me step backwards to answer your question. Sri Lanka is not alone in this. It's a shock to the system, but we are not alone, and it is true. There are 70 plus low and middle income countries at the moment suffering debt distress, at the verge of default or defaulted. Why? Why is it suddenly so pervasive? We have to take a step backwards to the 2006, 2008 US housing crisis, financial crisis. Following that crisis, the United States pumped a lot of dollars into their banks. Basically a way of rescuing the banks. So all of a sudden, there was a lot of liquidity flashing around. Banks and private investors, those playing in the bond markets, started looking for anywhere that yield will be higher than the close to zero interest rates that the Euro-American market was providing. So Sri Lanka went into the private bond markets in 2009. My country also went into the private bond markets around 2009. My country defaulted immediately after Sri Lanka's default.
I see.
My country went to the IMF the 17th time. The Sri Lanka also went to the IMF the 17th time.
A lot of similarities.
A lot of similarities. So we are in the middle of the same debates about restructuring debts as you are. But the current debt structure is different from the past. Now we are dealing with private bondholders. In the past, when Sri Lanka or Ghana went to the IMF for temporary balance of payment support, we were dealing largely with official donors. The Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, bilateral donors or lenders such as India, and so on. But now suddenly we have to deal with an entirely new situation. Why did we all Why did we default, and why is there many more countries defaulting? Because the United States have started tightening interest rates again following COVID, the splashing of money after COVID, in order to rein down inflation. So the cost of servicing the bonds, we used to borrow cheaper to recycle the old debt, and you keep refinancing. But now we cannot refinance because interest rates have hit the roof. So the cost of borrowing bonds have hit the roof. That is not Sri Lanka's fault. That is not Ghana's fault. Of course, we could always manage money a little better, but it's not just a question of corruption. It is a question of the way the international financial system is shaped. So we are similar. You ask the question, how do we get out of it? Well, first we have to restructure the debt. We have to deal with the sharing of the burden between our countries and the bondholders. The bondholders have made a lot of money out of us. Remember, when a bondholder buys a government bond in a developing country, they already price in their risks. That's why the average bond price, both the coupon price and the final yield, for many developing countries such as Sri Lanka or my country, Ghana, is several times the cost of that bond that is provided, bought from European and American banks. They have made their money already. This is why the restructuring debate now has got to be the amount of haircut that bondholders must make that makes it sustainable for us to manage our debt. Not just how much squeezing that our populations should be subjected to in order to create the fiscal space to pay bondholders.
Dr. Charles, now in Sri Lanka we have had the present government squeezing the people, as you put it, with higher taxes and various other means, in addition to the hardships that they are already undergoing due to inflation and high interest rates and so on. But shouldn't it be a matter of how much the people can afford to pay rather than how much the bondholders want the people to pay?
Exactly. It has to be how much people can afford to pay in order also for the economy to recover. The recovery of the economy, which is the recovery of the people's ability to earn an income and spend that income, ultimately also provides a demand for international bonds, if we should go there at all. You see, again, there's another thing in which Ghana and Sri Lanka are in a similar boat. Ghana was the first country that the IMF experimented behind the scenes the restructuring of domestic bonds side by side with the restructuring, so domestic debt restructuring, side by side with international debt restructuring, so external debt restructuring. What did they do? I was here in March last year. We were already warning that this will happen in Sri Lanka. So they asked for two haircuts. Pension holders, pension fund holders, so the national pension funds, and the banks. They asked that though it be frozen, you cannot withdraw, your returns from your bonds, from your pension funds, and the banks cannot withdraw, their investments from the central bank or anywhere else. Pension funds owners, which is the pensioners, went on a massive fight demonstration and stopped it. In Ghana, interestingly, it was led by a former Chief Justice, who was a woman. She was an honest woman whose only source of earnings was her work as a judge, many years. She depends on the returns from her pension funds to buy her medicines, to take care of her health. And this was supposed to be frozen for 3 years. Massive movement of working people who earn a pension, and they stopped it. I warned, in particular, last year that this would happen, so it has happened. So it's the banks who are taking a haircut. That haircut itself is a problem because it means interest rates go up. Small businesses cannot borrow from the banks. The small businesses cannot reinvest. But in your case, in Sri Lanka, it's workers, pensioners, who are carrying the burden. The people who have given all their lives, as working people. So they take a haircut. Question is, why are we merging the problem of domestic debt, which should be financed purely from domestic currency, whose resolution, even if we wanted to deal with it, is a different matter from foreign exchange, external debt, which is about paying in foreign exchange. Sri Lanka has a massive surplus in your current account. That means you are not short of dollars. So, in that sense, the question is, if you empty your reserves, which is mainly coming from remittances, how do you reinvest that remittances? And this is why the structuring of the debt, the reducing the debt overhang, cutting down the stock of bonds, the bondholders taking a share of the hit, just like the rest of society has taken, is a critical part of the ability of the Sri Lankan economy to recover. And in your case, since the pensioners and ordinary workers are bearing the burden of having to squeeze doubly, that it becomes possible for basic quality of life to return.
Dr. Hashim, to me it seems like it should be the government's duty in any country to protect the pension funds, because after all, that belongs to the most vulnerable sector of society. Retired people, they may be just retired, 60, 65 years old, or they may be 80 years old, and they have worked all their lives, and they've certainly propped up society for many decades. So shouldn't they be protected first, so that they can live out their golden years in some sort of happiness?
No, absolutely. I think I totally agree with Dr. Charles. I think the reason why they go after pension funds is because they think pension holders are weak, they're old, and they can possibly get a win in this situation. But the good thing, and I think this has been true in Greece when the IMF restructuring was happening, and also in Ghana, is that pension holders can also be political. They can come out on the streets, they can campaign for themselves, and at the end, in some cases, pension holders have been able to get some victories. What is clear is, these are people who paid a part of their income into a state-held pension fund, which the state was going to reinvest to be able to provide them pensions that would last them a while after they retired from government jobs. So the attack on pension holders, of course, is a absolutely uncalled for, but it is something that we are seeing across the board, and it is something that, I mean, social movements, but also political parties need to prepare for resisting.
But it's a life or death matter for many, isn't it? Because if you're 80 years old and you fall sick and you can't afford the medicine because the government pension fund isn't paying you what you should be due, you're going to probably die. And of course people will lament and say, well, you know, he's old, or he or she is old, fell sick and passed away. But if that person were a younger person, it would be almost like murder, isn't it? So the age doesn't really matter, whether you're 80 or you're 35. If you don't have the money because the government has squeezed the pension fund, then it's positively evil, isn't it?
No, but let's also think about the other question. What is happening to young people in our countries? We are mostly countries with heavily young populations, with most of our population between 10 and 30. Many of these people graduating from colleges or technical schools, looking for jobs, hoping that the economy is going to open up, that there will be room. So we're talking about pension holders, which may arguably be a privileged position now to even think about a pension. What about the young people who are going into the job market now, into jobs that do not offer pensions, if they get a job? Because with the economic contraction, we see youth unemployment rising across all debt-stressed countries, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Ghana included. And the important thing is for political parties to have their own economic agenda. Sadly, in many of our countries, we do not have our own economic agenda anymore. It is the IMF's agenda that is primarily what constitutes both our sort of macroeconomic policy and like the nitty-gritty of what happens in the day-to-day. In Pakistan, the IMF actually sits in the finance ministry. They also, the sort of governor of the state bank was the IMF's man in Egypt. So for us, our economic policy is when they say you don't do enough, well, for us the question is, but it's literally you making the policy sitting in those institutions. So the tricky problem is both what to do with pensioners, but also what do we do with the new generations that are hopeless, that are, you know, leaving our countries often sometimes on boat, sometimes using dangerous routes. Only last year there were 400 Pakistanis that sank in a boat off Greece.
A terrible tragedy, yes.
And these tragedies will continue to happen in our countries if we don't fix the economy for both the old and the young.
The People's Platform.
Brainbusters with Slits Season 4. Are you ready? Anand College, Colombo. Mahinda College, Gaur. Maharama College, Colombo. Pariganaka Yuge Purogamia.
Ramani Fonse, Devendra Pradipagare, Charles Babbage.
The answer is correct. Brainbusters with Slits Season 4. Tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. on TV1.
Etek, metek, oba notutu. Siyasin dak bala gatayu. Siyalla abhibhavami. Alutrena. Eli Mahan ප්‍රාසංගික ප්‍රතිහාරය.
Be ready. Surround. The hunt for talent continues. To unearth the stars of the future, the global sensation acclaimed in 70 countries worldwide returns to Sri Lanka for a thrilling second season. Sri Lanka's Got Talent Season 2. An international stage for the next generation of superstars. Tomorrow, 8:30 p.m. Only on Sirasa TV. Don't miss it.
We live in a world of progress. But what if progress isn't reaching everyone? Millions of Sri Lankans struggle without access to clean water, safe roads, and bridges to a better life. But you have reached out. You have touched their lives. Thank you, Sri Lanka, for making Gammadda the most impactful rural development movement in our nation. Gammadda, for the people, by the people.
ඔය බටර් ගෑවිලා නතර කරලා මේ සල්ලි ටික දීලා අරකි අතප්පයක් කල්ලා දානවා. ටික දවසට හරියට අපිට නිදහසේ ඉන්න. එනි මොන කරන්නද මම? ගාන උසර පොළවේ. යන්න බලන්න.
මිස්ටර්ට ඕනේ සෝෂල් මීඩියා හරහා මඩක් ගහන්නනේ. මේකට අපි ලම් ප්ලෑන්ස් ගොඩක් තියෙනවා.
තර්ඩ් ක්ලාස් මිනිස්සු වැඩට ගත්තාම ඉතින් මෙහෙම තමයි වෙන්නේ.
ඔයා කොහොමද හරියටම කියන්නේ මෙයා තර්ඩ් ක්ලාස් කියලා?
බැලු බැලමට පේනවනේ මිස්.
සමහර පිරිමි ඉන්නවනේ මේ පෙනුම පිරිමි වගේ වුණාට සත්තු වගේ වැඩ කරන.
නීල පබලු අද රාත්‍රී 9ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්. The People's Platform.
The brain drain, which Dr. Hashim referred to, it's across the board. It's yes, mainly young people, people in their 20s, their 30s, but it's not just the lower strata of society, laborers and so on. We have graduates who are leaving. We have specialist doctors. So how do you rebuild a country and its economy when all your best people are leaving?
Tragedy, as you explained it, Hashimi, is of people dying in the boats. In the case of Africa, they're dying starting from the Sahara Desert, so people trekking through the desert before they get to the boats and so on. But it's also a very active effort by rich countries to attract professionals out of our countries.
So is this another form of colonialism?
It is a colonialism. It is neo-colonialism. It's a different way of extracting. So they're offering our nurses, our doctors, our scientists, our IT technologies. They're moving them out constantly. It is not that, it contrasts with the past where we sent people because we wanted to create and learn from them to come and apply and adapt in our economies. Now they are permanent extraction of the best. Why is this happening? Because for many decades, we've had economies that are, the whole financialization, the dominance of financial capital for over 20, 30 years. In the past, money moved to around the world where it made the most impact on productivity. So it went to industry, manufacturing. It went into agriculture. It went into rural roads. It went into training. But now, money moves around to money centers. So a bond, for example, bondholders basically finance and they recycle that money wherever they get a return. So it keeps moving. It's hot money. it's not productive capital. So that nature of money has changed, making it difficult to grow economies at an earlier stage of development, such as Sri Lanka or Ghana. And we have to learn to understand the dangers of dependence on finance capital. One of the lessons on this whole international sovereign bond issue, we ask the question, does a country like Ghana or Sri Lanka, at an early stage of development, need that much foreign exchange debts? Are we matured enough to go to a speculative market for capital? Is most of our financing needs domestic currency? Therefore, should we restructure our economy for stability so we can depend more on domestic money, which is local currency, and work on our exports so that we deal with, or the better management of our remittances, so we deal with the foreign exchange needs for imports? Many of the richer middle income countries, we should learn from them. The Brazilians or the Indians hardly participate in the international sovereign bond market. Why? Because they are determined to develop on the back of their own local currency. Because international sovereign debt, which is in foreign exchange, imposes two problems. Problem is the cost itself, interest rates. The second problem is the cost of converting your local currency into foreign currency, the exchange rate. So it is a special additional cost to small economies that cannot afford. So part of the conversation in Sri Lanka, as it should be in Ghana, is not simply how quickly we go back to the international sovereign bond market, but whether we should.
Dr. Hashim, let's talk about, now we spoke about Ghana, we spoke about Pakistan. What about other countries like, for example, Argentina, which is very much in the news? What's the situation there? Because Argentina was a developed country several decades ago, and it was the finest economy in South America. But now, over the last few years, it is a basket case, just like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, or Ghana. What's the situation with Argentina?
I think Argentina is, of course, like all of our countries, a long story. But the short end of it is that in the 2010s, the Argentina was able to get out of IMF debt. And then there was a political government change. A left-wing formation was replaced by a right-wing one, which the US favored. And suddenly you had the IMF give the biggest loan ever of $50 billion. And largely, if you look at $50 billion US dollars, for Pakistan and Sri Lanka, which are used to like 3 to 7 billion, and us not being able to deal with that, I mean, imagine what 50 billion would mean. And the reason for going that high is not because the country needed it, but because you give them a number that they cannot get out of in the future. And that's the tragedy of the IMF debt trap, is that they actually don't lend you that much. Right? So out of Pakistan's 130 billion in external debt, the IMF is barely 5 to 6 billion. In terms of Sri Lanka, it's about 6% or 7% of Sri Lanka's debt portfolio. With Argentina, the 50 billion makes it quite significant. But largely, these institutions that control our policy are actually not the ones that are our biggest lenders. And that really puts a very strange kind of configuration in which it seems the most difficult thing to negotiate with your sort of smallest lender, as it were. The Argentinian economy is going through restructuring. There has been an assault on unions. I think everywhere where the IMF is operating since the 90s, there has been an assault on organized labor. There is also an ongoing attack on pensions in Argentina. And there has been a shift towards an even more right-wing government, both sort of in terms of political ideology, but also in terms of the political economic thinking. And yeah.
And you see, since we've been here, we've been here also with the former Argentinian finance minister who did the restructuring to bring IMF debt to zero and basically turn down IMF financing. It doesn't mean that there is no technical role for the IMF, but financing holds a country, like, basically in bondage. You have to remember that, see, the IMF at the moment is not what it was perceived to be when it was being created. Provide temporary balance of payment support so countries have a flexibility to adjust without cutting down imports too much. As you can see in the case of Sri Lanka, as in Ghana, there's not much money coming out of the IMF. So your resolution of the fuel thing is not so much money from the IMF, but support from the Indians.
That's right.
And so you see, but its role is now to ensure that bondholders minimize their losses. It is our responsibility to ensure that we optimize our gains. And therefore the IMF is not necessarily a neutral arbiter. We had a conversation with one of our political parties yesterday. It's a very, I can't say where, but it was a very revealing conversation. The question was asked, but why the party had a clear understanding of the macroeconomic problems that they were dealing with. So it's not a lack of an understanding of what we need to do. So he said, but therefore, since you know this, why did you go to the IMF? Knowing that once you have an IMF financing, first and foremost, it's expensive. Sri Lanka is paying more than 8% interest rate on its IMF loan, so you add to the debt burden, and then you basically subjugate to the IMF. And the answer was, we laughed about it, but we needed some institution to discipline us so we can take the decisions we need to take, right? Well, the institution doesn't discipline you just for the sake of your interests. The institution disciplines you for the interest of its principal owners. And they serve finance capital. And we have to make these trade-offs. The alternative, we said, but why are you not organizing a national conference to discuss the difficult decisions we need to take to shift our country away from this future, this problem of indebtedness, so that we are not going back to the IMF the 18th time. Because you need a consensus with your population, and if the population understands the hard decision that you are making, you discuss the relative sharing of the burden of your internal adjustment.
So Dr. Hashim, we have just a few minutes remaining of this very interesting conversation. Now, Ghana has been to the IMF 17 times. Sri Lanka has been to the IMF 17 times. It doesn't seem to have got much better at all, and people are already, experts are already talking about Sri Lanka probably needing to go back to the IMF for an 18th time within a few years. So my question is, as a layman, does the IMF program work, or is it an eternal sort of fact of life? Is it like that famous song Hotel California, where you can never leave? Is that what's the situation there? Are there countries which have had success stories on this?
I mean, so the Argentina case is an example of them trying to leave and being forced to be brought back in. And I think there is that larger question remains whether there is actually an IMF success story. And when we keep asking this question to IMF officials, and the success stories are always temporary, they'll say, oh, Pakistan is doing really well right now, only for it to 1 year later declare that it's on the verge of bankruptcy. So we only have IMF success stories while the program is running at its peak, but when it fails to deliver, it actually becomes our problem. So that question of leaving the IMF, as far as I'm aware, no one's really been able to do it. I think there's a larger point as we sort of move towards concluding or at least a few points that need to be made. One, I think the tricky problem is every country feels like they have to negotiate with the IMF alone. Whereas there are at least 77 other countries which are in similar circumstances, if not more. So the IMF does not negotiate with you on a country-to-country basis. It's not the local staff of the IMF do not come up with tailored solutions that are specific to Sri Lanka. If you look at the policies, they will be the same for Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Argentina, Ghana, all in very different parts of the world, all very different sort of economies. One is an island, others might be landlocked. They're coming up with the same package. So why don't we negotiate together? And even if negotiation is not possible with the IMF directly, there are ongoing processes in the UN, such as the Financing for Development Framework, which is being developed, where our countries are either quiet or not proactive enough in terms of providing an alternate agenda, where the IMF is actually being made to come on the table not as an arbiter, but as one of many equal sovereign partners that are able to talk. The other problem is that we need to keep looking at whether the same policies that are being prescribed by the IMF in my country have been implemented in a different country. So Sri Lanka this week is unbundling the power sector. In Pakistan, they did it in 1998. Right now, the power sector has something called circular debt of about $9 billion US. Where our unbundling does not work is the Pakistan case study. But why is no one talking about it in Sri Lanka? And so we keep repeating like policy errors that have been advocated in other countries. They come to us and we pretend like it's going to work for us.
Right.
But it can't work for us.
Final question to Dr. Charles. What about the possibility of writing off debt, such as in 1953, I believe, the German debt was written off?
Yes. If you write off all of the 77 countries who are currently indebted, it has very little impact on the global financial system. It's small. But the reason why they won't write it is that now that debt belongs to private investors, and we've been sent in that way, and the private investors would not write off their profits. And this is the difference between the current configuration of debt and the past configuration of debt. This is the reason why we have to be cleverer and hard-nosed in doing our work that ensures that those who have benefited from lending to us also take an adequate haircut. So in the case of Sri Lanka, the haircut being discussed is 28%. The Argentinians got more than 50% to 70%. We have to be harder. And we know that that haircut is insufficient to create debt sustainability in Sri Lanka. And it's definitely insufficient to generate the growth necessary to bring back employment and incomes to people. So we have to put our alternative numbers on the table, because after all, now the private creditors also have something to lose.
And I'm afraid on that note we are out of time. My thanks to Dr. Hashim bin Rashid of the Sociology Department of the University of Pennsylvania, and Dr. Charles Abugre, Executive Director of Ideas. Thank you very much for sharing all these excellent insights with us, and I'm sure our audience has learned a lot from both of you. Thank you, and I wish you a pleasant stay in Sri Lanka, and thank you very much to all of you at home for watching. Good night.